and thank you for having me for such a well-organized event. I am going to rush through the presentation to leave lots of time for questions if I can. It will be fully available through the website. And if there are 3 points that you take home from this presentation, they are this. First and foremost, when it comes to climate change impacts, the rubber hits the proverbial road with municipalities. Second, climate change liabilities for municipalities are here and they are increasing. And Arthur and Craig actually quantified the rate of increase in terms of major events. Demonstrating diligence for municipalities is necessary and must be regularly updated in terms of the known climate science. And thirdly, we're not just talking about liabilities for municipalities. There is a very significant and growing amount of impact investment, environmental and social governance funding that is looking for precisely the type of local infrastructure projects that you are now implementing. So let's talk about both fear and opportunity when we go through this. Next slide. So this is really the diagram that you need to be aware of in relation to the changing climate. The point to take from this slide is that it is nearly impossible, i.e., it is not diligent to argue that further warming and disruptive climate events are not known and foreseeable. They are very well known at this point and very foreseeable. Next slide. Craig and Arthur spoke of the increasing in climate risk at twice the rate in northern climates. In some of Ontario's most northern climates, it's up to 4 times the rate of the world average. So let's look at some of the physical and transition risks. And this maps very directly on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requirements. The physical risk can be event-driven, very acute, or can result from chronic weather patterns. And so both are very important. We're not just talking about those acute events. Certainly they are the most financially impactful in the long term, in the short term, but in the longer term, we've got bigger issues as well. We talked about extreme weather events, hurricanes and floods, acute events of warming, and the increased severity frequency of fires. Chronic physical risks include longer shifts in weather patterns, sustained higher temperatures, and rising sea levels or chronic heat waves. And this certainly affects municipal infrastructure design, construction, resilience, supply chains, and logistics. One may look south to California to look at Pacific Gas and Electric and the local impacts of a warming climate on electricity infrastructure that caused billions of damage and a host of litigation. You heard exactly about the $2.4 billion in severe weather events from Chris and Arthur. And there are also associated transition risks in shifting to a lower carbon economy. So these include policy and technical and technology risks, as well as market changes to address not just the adaptation that we spoke of. Next slide. So let's go through some of the cases, and I'll give you a broad brush picture of what's going on. At the federal level, there is a very significant body of case law that's developing that really argues that the federal government is not doing enough. We're seeing a host of cases that are pushing from Indigenous communities with traditional territories that overlap a number of municipalities, from youth groups that are all saying, certainly the federal government is not doing enough, that the charter applies, and that there should be associated liability. Next slide. The nature of these claims is really based on policy inaction and tracking what's going on with the science of warming, the known and foreseeable, hear those words again, known and foreseeable science of warming and climate impacts, and the associated policy action taken by governments writ large. And this is really bolstered by a body of science that is being used increasingly internationally and starting to come into play domestically, called attribution science. What portion of this harm can we scientifically attribute to this level of an inaction? Suncor is currently involved in a US case of this nature. In the Netherlands and Peru, we've seen RWE in Germany, an electricity generator, be attached to harm on a Peruvian farm. And so lots of activity going there. Here are a couple more of the youth cases that are really pushing both at the Ontario level and at the federal level, arguing from a youth perspective that the federal government is not doing enough. And they're seeking declaratory relief, asking the government to order, asking the courts to order government to adopt a climate recovery plan. So you've seen the federal level in these cases, you've seen this at the provincial level. How long do you think it will be before a large municipal government has a related climate case? I can tell you, it's well known that they're in the works now, so be prepared. Be diligent for known, foreseeable liabilities and cases that are coming your way. So let's look at what municipalities need to be thinking about. You heard from David Miller that climate change is an urgent global issue and there's clear scientific consensus, and that there are a number of acute events and policies that you can think of. He mentioned buildings, transportation, waste, and electricity. I would add to that list of 50, sorry about that. That would be in relation to development plans and policies at a municipal level. And we are certainly seeing activities there in and around the city of Oakville with the class action lawsuit that we'll talk about a little bit more. So 5 pillars of what municipalities can do. One of the key things is that one of the courts that we thought would be one of the most adversarial to upholding federal climate change legislation was Saskatchewan. And in fact, a majority of the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, as well as the Ontario Court of Appeal, held that human-caused climate change poses an existential threat. And so if we've got the judiciary at the highest level of court in specific jurisdiction making these pronouncements, it's going to be very hard for municipalities to argue other than that. You also have net zero legislation coming into place. And you've got the systemic multiplier of climate change acting to really confound municipal development and actions and deliberations on how to reduce carbon footprint. And I'm so glad that Craig and Arthur spoke about nature-based climate solutions and the impact, the necessity of quantifying the impact, actually valuing either through a social cost of carbon or an insurance value or an avoided cost value of municipal decisions and provincial decisions to destroy nature-based climate solutions that are increasing the protection right now. Certainly we've got this as a clear municipal risk, and how municipalities disclose the actions that they're taking is increasingly important. About 60% of all public infrastructure in Canada is municipally owned and operated. The vast majority of that infrastructure is at risk from climate change perspective, whether it's municipally owned electricity distributors or municipally owned sewer plants or municipally owned roads that are subject to flooding. There's a very significant amount that you've got to do in relation to age, condition, population growth, and the testing and design, forward-looking design of those critical assets. About 80% of Canadians live and work in cities and municipalities. And that's very significant. And their revenue sources are similarly limited. And cities, like other companies, may have climate risk exposure in their investment portfolio and the bonds that they issue. Now, that's the downside. There may also be related financial opportunities in the bonds that they may issue. So specifically, I'm talking about green bonds. Next slide. Let's look at some of the municipal specific litigation. Most of these cases revolve around flooding, and I don't see these decreasing in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I see them going beyond flooding, going into development, as we've seen in Oakville, and into sewer protection as well, and electricity, as we're seeing enhanced challenges to electricity grids associated with the overarching increase in ambient temperature. So the first is the Maple Ridge class action. We had 15 households file a suit against a developer and a contractor and engineering firms and the city of Maple Ridge after a 2010 flood. We have Anderson and Manitoba, $950 million class action brought forward by 4,000 residents of 4 First Nations following severe flooding in the spring of 2021. We have Decatur and Chambly. It was dismissed. However, the court noted that design standard might not protect municipalities in future lawsuits. The court specifically said, if you're not diligent in your design, you may not have protection from liability. So this is, historical. And going back to 2002, we saw class action lawsuits for flooding and settlement in the nature of $7.7 million against the city of Stratford. And all of these are very, very relevant to how you show and prove diligence. I want to just comment briefly on the current Oakville class action, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Do you want to go to the next slide while I'm doing that, Chris? It's not really a climate lawsuit per se. It's really about development and specifically changing the boundaries of a floodplain, one could argue fairly prudently, in a manner that would be notionally diligent. So this is an instance where the necessity of changing a floodplain boundary, the necessity of prudent future development may, in fact, be used as a defense by a municipal actor who is faced with potential liability. Are we taking the best actions necessary? Are we, in fact, ensuring that we're meeting our duty of care? And how do we address people affected by that? So watch that case and see if the climate change as a defense comes up as it makes its way through the courts. A number of other cases, I've got them listed for you here. And the key elements, if you want to go to the next slide, Chris, are really about, do you have a duty? Does the municipality owe the plaintiff a duty of care? They breach that duty of care by failing to meet the requisite standard of care. And what is that standard right now? Is it sufficient to build on a floodplain? Is it sufficient to not have a climate change plan at a municipal level? Is it sufficient to not demand adaptation measures of your electricity level, utility? It's very hard to argue that at this point. And then you have to look at whether that breach caused damage to the plaintiff, where attribution science is becoming much more important, and whether it was reasonably foreseeable. If you did nothing about your deteriorating municipal water and sewage system, is it reasonably foreseeable with once in a 1,000-year floods happening once every 50 years that you will have some trouble? And so these are the key elements that really look to imposing and providing for litigants to take action against municipalities. And so what is the defense? You want to go to the next slide? The defense really is looking to prove diligence. And I'm pleased to say that we're very close to finalizing software in association with Radical. Radical Balance is a company in Canada that's done something similar in the agricultural industry to help municipalities effectively digitize proof of diligence. It's a very detailed due diligence checklist that provides for a lens on policy development, on electricity, on buildings, on transportation and waste, and gets updated as the relevant circumstances change. So reach out if you have further interest in that. But in the interim, look at how you inspect, maintain building infrastructure, particularly with regard to climate-related risks. How do you approve development, particularly in known flooding areas? How do you respond to complaints? Is it timely? How do you adhere to your own policies, particularly being where you've got a policy in place and you do not reflect or adhere to it in a decision? And so with that regard, I note that Leanne Brannigan asked a really good question about how do you bring your council along? And one of the elements is quantifying the potential loss and impacts. If you fail to include, for example, climate practices in your municipal infrastructure procurements, if you fail to take action, what are the potential liabilities and insurance costs that you're potentially subject to? And what does litigation look like? Next slide. Certainly municipal responses to climate change. What can we do? What must we do? And there's the sweet spot of required mitigation, required adaptation, voluntary mitigation, and voluntary adaptation. And in particular, in the two voluntary elements and proactive planning, it can definitely overlap with what's increasingly being called the associated environmental racism of climate change. And David spoke of this in the terms social equity or the inevitable impacts of climate change. It's not unusual for you to have particular lower income neighborhoods and communities in your broader municipality disproportionately impacted by climate change impacts. So there may be a number of fixes that get done by proactive and diligent planning in the future. Next slide. Some municipal leaders, I do think very strongly that a few Canadian municipalities need to be called out for really being not just domestic leaders, but also global leaders in their response to climate change. Toronto has now got a task force for climate-related financial disclosure, compliant climate disclosures, and they've had that since 2018. The Atmospheric Fund and Julia Langer needs a real call out in terms of pushing climate-related investment in municipal infrastructure. Toronto Green Standard, Vancouver, new buildings in Vancouver being required to meet a net zero energy ready standard by 2032. Really important to see those interim targets along the way to zero emission targets in buildings, and nationally in 2050, we're seeing that. In Calgary, climate adaptation plan. Resilience, as you can tell by the rebrand of the firm, is increasingly important, looking not just to mitigation, but adaptation to update design guidelines. For example, electricity distribution and transmission interconnections Simply building them up 1 foot costs virtually nothing, but saves millions in potential climate liabilities. So these are all things that can be done. Next slide. Edmonton, Montreal, Halifax, great things going on there as well. And I'd like to talk to those jurisdictions specifically in the opportunity category of where we're going. This isn't all bad news. When we talk about the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, a Low Carbon Cities Canada coalition. Next slide. This is giving you some background on what we're seeing as the best practices right now in climate-related disclosures. This is predominantly for public issuers, but increasingly we're seeing this applied to governments as a measure of diligence. And it's noteworthy that TCFD is now mandatory in the UK and in Australia. And in our view, it's just a short matter of time before this is mandatory in Canada. Next, there is a specific guide in TCFD for cities that I would commend to you, and it's linked in the presentation if you want to have a look at it. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight that there is money available, lots of it, for municipalities to really push the envelope through a very innovative LC3 structure. So there's more information on this slide. So over to you, I think, for questions.